June 8, 1962, the day 20th Century Fox didn't just fire Marilyn Monroe, they broke her brain. The studio didn't simply terminate her contract for Something's Got to Give. They sued her for hundreds of thousands of dollars, publicly blamed her for the film's failure, and transformed Hollywood's biggest star into the industry's most famous liability overnight. If you lived through the 1960s, you understand what the studio system could do to a performer who stepped out of line. The executives wielded absolute power, the contracts were ironclad, and Marilyn Monroe had just become their cautionary tale. But here's what most people still don't understand about that summer morning when Fox delivered their devastating verdict. This wasn't merely a career crisis, this was a psychological demolition happening inside the mind of a woman whose brain was already rewired for danger, already primed to see threats in every shadow. Because when Dr. Ralph Greenson sat down to review his patient's mental state in the weeks following her termination, he documented something that would remain buried in his clinical notes for decades. He described Marilyn Monroe as experiencing what he termed paranoid reactions, not paranoia as mental illness, not schizophrenia, paranoid reactions as an adaptive response to genuine documented threat. Her brain was doing exactly what evolution designed brains to do when the world proves it's trying to destroy you. It was adapting, it was protecting, it was rewiring every neural pathway to detect danger before danger could strike again. And then, in late July 1962, Marilyn went to Cal Neva Lodge for a weekend that would become one of Hollywood's most disputed mysteries. When she returned to her Brentwood home, those paranoid reactions went into overdrive. If this story resonates with you, if you want to understand the real psychology behind Hollywood's most tragic legend, subscribe to this channel, because we're about to explore territory that conspiracy theories have obscured for 60 years. To comprehend what happened to Marilyn Monroe after Cal Neva, you must first understand the psychological landscape Dr. Ralph Greenson had been mapping for over a year. Greenson wasn't just any psychiatrist, he was one of the most respected psychoanalysts in Los Angeles, a clinician who approached each case with methodical precision. And when he looked at Marilyn Monroe, he saw something that terrified him professionally. In his private notes that researchers would eventually access through his family decades later, Greenson used a word that captures everything about Marilyn's psychological vulnerability in 1962. He called her a waif, not a star, not an icon. A waif, unprotected, alone, fundamentally defenseless in a world populated by people who viewed her as commodity rather than human being. But Greenson's clinical observations went deeper than simple vulnerability assessment. He documented what he described as Marilyn's tendency toward paranoid reactions, and this phrase is crucial to understanding her final summer. Greenson made a critical distinction that most people miss when they hear the word paranoid. He wasn't diagnosing paranoid personality disorder. He wasn't suggesting schizophrenia. He was describing a psychological pattern that emerges from real trauma, real abandonment, real environmental threat. Modern neuroscience has validated exactly what Greenson observed in 1962. When someone experiences repeated trauma, particularly trauma rooted in childhood abandonment and adult betrayal, their amygdala becomes hypersensitive to threat cues. Their entire threat detection system recalibrates to a hair trigger setting because historically, waiting to confirm danger has meant getting hurt. Marilyn Monroe's childhood reads like a textbook case study in developmental trauma: orphanages, foster homes, sexual abuse, a mother institutionalized with severe mental illness. By the time Norma Jean Baker became Marilyn Monroe, her brain had already learned one fundamental lesson that no amount of fame could erase. People leave, people betray, people hurt. Greenson understood this architecture of trauma. What he documented in 1962 wasn't mental illness emerging from nowhere. It was adaptive psychology reaching its breaking point under unprecedented stress. The entertainment industry of 1962 operated under mechanisms of control that younger generations struggle to comprehend. The studio system wasn't simply an employment structure, it was a totalizing institution that owned every aspect of a performer's existence. Studios controlled which projects actors could accept, which public appearances they could make, which romantic relationships they could pursue. They could destroy careers with a single phone call. They could manipulate public perception through their extensive media connections, and in June 1962, 20th Century Fox decided to exercise that full spectrum of institutional power against Marilyn Monroe. Something's Got to Give had been troubled from the beginning. Marilyn was dealing with chronic sinusitis and respiratory infections that made consistent attendance nearly impossible. She had missed numerous shooting days, creating budget overruns that sent Fox executives into panic mode. The studio was already financially hemorrhaging from the catastrophic production of Cleopatra. Fox needed a scapegoat. They needed someone to blame for their mounting losses, and Marilyn Monroe, despite being the biggest box office drawer in Hollywood, became their sacrifice. On June 8, 1962, Fox didn't just fire Marilyn. They orchestrated a comprehensive public relations assault designed to destroy her professional reputation. Studio executives leaked stories claiming Marilyn was unprofessional, unreliable, mentally unstable. They announced they were replacing her with Lee Remick. They filed a lawsuit seeking hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages, publicly blaming Marilyn for the entire production failure. For someone with Marilyn's psychological profile, this wasn't simply professional adversity. Her brain, already primed by Greenson's documented tendency toward paranoid reactions, interpreted Fox's actions exactly the way trauma-informed neuroscience would predict. The abandonment patterns from childhood were activating. The exploitation fears from decades in Hollywood were confirming. Every neural pathway that Greenson had been trying to help her rewire was flooding with stress hormones, with cortisol and adrenaline, with the neurochemistry of panic and hypervigilance. But here's what makes this psychological siege even more devastating. Marilyn's paranoid reactions weren't irrational. They were completely horrifyingly accurate. Fox was actively trying to destroy her career. Studio executives were coordinating negative press coverage. Industry power brokers were discussing whether Marilyn Monroe was still insurable, still bankable, still worth the risk. The threats her traumatized brain was detecting weren't hallucinations. They were documented reality. In the 6 weeks between her firing and her death, people who knew Marilyn Monroe noticed changes in her behavior that went beyond ordinary anxiety or depression. These weren't subtle shifts visible only to trained clinicians. These were dramatic alterations in how she moved through the world, how she interacted with her environment, how she related to people who had been constants in her life for years. And every single behavioral marker aligns perfectly with what modern trauma research describes as hypervigilance response. Hypervigilance isn't simply being alert or cautious. It's a state of perpetual threat scanning where the nervous system never fully relaxes, where even neutral stimuli trigger defensive responses. People experiencing hypervigilance startle at small sounds because their amygdala is processing every auditory input as potential danger before their conscious mind can evaluate context. They scan rooms constantly, tracking exits and potential threats. They struggle with sleep because the neurological systems designed to maintain vigilance can't shut down long enough for restorative rest to occur. And this is exactly what people around Marilyn began observing after she returned from Cal Neva in late July. She would flinch at noises that had never bothered her before. The sound of a car door closing outside her Brentwood home would send her to the window, checking who had arrived, why they were there, whether she was safe. Phone calls became sources of anxiety rather than connection. She would stare at the ringing telephone, paralyzed by uncertainty about who was calling, what they wanted. Friends who had known her for years described a quality of tension in her body that hadn't been present before, a coiled readiness that suggested she was perpetually preparing for attack. The trust erosion was even more profound. Marilyn began questioning the motivations of people who had been in her inner circle for extended periods. Was her publicist actually protecting her interests, or working with the studios against her? Were her friends genuinely supportive, or gathering information to sell to gossip columnists? Was even Dr. Greenson truly helping her, or documenting her instability for some future professional purpose? These weren't abstract philosophical questions. They were urgent survival calculations happening in a brain that had learned through brutal experience that betrayal often came from those closest to you. Modern neuroscience explains this trust collapse with painful clarity. Chronic stress and repeated betrayal literally reshape the neural pathways that allow humans to feel safe in relationships. The brain begins treating all social connections as potential threats rather than sources of support. And for someone like Marilyn, whose entire childhood was defined by adults who should have protected her instead, abandoning or abusing her, this neurological rewiring wasn't creating new pathways. It was reinforcing the oldest, deepest patterns her brain had ever learned. Declassified FBI files from the 1960s reveal that Marilyn Monroe was, in fact, under surveillance during the final months of her life. The Bureau had opened a file on her because of her connections to individuals they considered security risks. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was notorious for surveillance operations that extended far beyond legitimate national security concerns, targeting celebrities whose personal lives interested the Bureau's director. Marilyn Monroe absolutely fell within that scope. So when her traumatized brain detected surveillance, when her hypervigilant nervous system triggered alarms about being watched and monitored, she wasn't hallucinating. She was picking up on genuine patterns that her threat detection system was evolutionarily designed to notice. This creates an almost unbearable psychological paradox. Dr. Greenson was treating Marilyn for paranoid reactions, trying to help her distinguish between real threats and trauma-amplified perceptions. But some of her perceptions were accurate. The challenge wasn't convincing her that no one was watching. The challenge was helping her nervous system tolerate the reality that yes, some powerful entities were tracking her movements, and no, this didn't mean that every person was an enemy. It meant learning to live with genuine threat while not allowing that threat to consume every moment of consciousness. And that psychological tightrope is nearly impossible to walk when your brain has been shaped by decades of trauma and your current environment keeps confirming your worst fears. The medication cycle that developed during this period reveals another dimension of Marilyn's psychological crisis. She had been using barbiturates and sedatives for years to manage chronic insomnia, but in the summer of 1962, her relationship with these medications shifted from management to desperation. When you're experiencing hypervigilance, when your nervous system is locked in perpetual threat response, sleep becomes neurologically impossible. Your amygdala won't allow your consciousness to fully shut down because unconsciousness means vulnerability, so you take medication to force your brain into temporary shutdown. But barbiturates don't produce restorative sleep, they produce sedation that leaves you groggy and cognitively impaired the next day, which increases your anxiety, which intensifies your hypervigilance, which makes the next night even harder. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing, creating exactly the kind of dangerous dependency that would later fuel decades of conspiracy theories about Marilyn's death. Late July 1962, Cal Neva Lodge sits on the border between California and Nevada, straddling the state line in a way that made it simultaneously glamorous and dangerous. Frank Sinatra owned a stake in the property. The guest list included some of Hollywood's most powerful figures and some of organized crime's most notorious operators. It was exactly the kind of environment where Marilyn Monroe's brain, already hypervigilant and threat scanning, would find countless triggers. The details of what actually happened during that weekend remain disputed and incomplete. Reliable sources confirm that Marilyn was there. They confirm that she stayed briefly. But the specifics remain wrapped in the kind of ambiguity that feeds conspiracy theories while frustrating historians. What we know with certainty is what happened after Marilyn returned to Los Angeles. The behavioral changes that friends and colleagues had been observing intensified dramatically. Whatever occurred at Cal Neva, whether it was a specific incident or simply the cumulative effect of being in a high-stress environment while psychologically vulnerable, it functioned as what trauma therapists call a trigger event. Not the original trauma, not the root cause, but the stimulus that activates all the dormant fear pathways, that reminds the nervous system of every previous moment of danger and betrayal, that convinces the brain that the threats are not only real but imminent. People who saw Marilyn in the days following Cal Neva described someone who seemed fundamentally altered. The hypervigilance was more pronounced, the trust issues were more severe, the sense of impending doom was palpable in her voice, her body language, her inability to relax even in familiar settings. She talked about feeling unsafe in ways that went beyond the studio crisis, beyond the lawsuit, beyond the career concerns. She expressed fears that suggested her threat detection system had moved from high alert to emergency status. Dr. Greenson saw her multiple times during this period. His clinical notes from these sessions describe a patient in acute psychological distress. But here's what makes Greenson's position so tragically complex. He was trying to treat paranoid reactions in a patient whose external reality kept confirming that she had legitimate reasons to be afraid. How do you help someone regulate their threat response when they're actually being threatened? How do you teach someone to distinguish between real danger and amplified perception when both are present simultaneously? Greenson was attempting psychological intervention in a situation that required environmental change, but he had no power to alter Marilyn's environment. He couldn't make Fox withdraw their lawsuit. He couldn't silence the press coverage. He couldn't protect her from whatever happened at Cal Neva. The 2 weeks between Cal Neva and August 5, 1962, represent a period where all the neurological systems we've discussed reached critical mass. Marilyn's hypervigilance was now constant. Sleep had become nearly impossible, even with heavy sedation. Trust had eroded to the point where she was questioning everyone's intentions. The medication cycle was spiraling. The professional crisis with Fox remained unresolved. And her brain, operating under stress loads that would overwhelm any nervous system, was trying desperately to keep her alive using the only strategies it knew: heightened threat detection, defensive isolation, chemical sedation to force temporary respite from unbearable consciousness. Friends who saw her during this period described conversations that revealed the depth of her psychological distress. She talked about feeling trapped, about seeing no way forward that didn't involve more pain and exposure. She expressed fears that went beyond career concerns or relationship failures. She articulated a bone-deep exhaustion that came from years of trying to manage a nervous system that never truly felt safe, from decades of performing normalcy while internally experiencing constant crisis. Dr. Greenson increased the frequency of their sessions, recognizing that his patient was in acute crisis. But psychiatric intervention has limits when the crisis is rooted in genuine environmental threat, combined with neurological patterns established over decades. Greenson couldn't rewire Marilyn's amygdala in a few sessions. He couldn't eliminate the studio lawsuit or the press coverage or whatever trauma Cal Neva had activated. He was trying to prevent immediate catastrophe while knowing that sustainable healing would require resources and time that might not be available. The medications in Marilyn's Brentwood home on August 5, 1962, tell their own story about a brain in crisis: barbiturates to force sleep, sedatives to manage anxiety. The chemistry of desperation accumulated on bedside tables because when your nervous system is locked in perpetual threat response, when your amygdala is flooding your consciousness with danger signals every waking moment, you reach for whatever tools might provide temporary relief. And when those tools are central nervous system depressants, when the dosages required to achieve effect keep increasing, the margin between therapeutic use and lethal dose becomes terrifyingly narrow. For 60 years, Marilyn Monroe's death has been analyzed through the lens of conspiracy. Who killed her? What did she know? Which powerful men had motives to silence her? These questions have generated thousands of articles, dozens of books, countless documentaries, but this framing fundamentally misses what Dr. Greenson's clinical notes reveal about her final summer. The real story isn't about external assassins, it's about internal collapse. It's about what happens when a brain shaped by childhood trauma and adult exploitation confronts a perfect storm of genuine threats and neurological vulnerability. The paranoid reactions Greenson documented weren't evidence of mental illness requiring institutionalization. They were evidence of a threat detection system operating exactly as evolution designed it to operate when facing genuine danger. The problem wasn't that Marilyn's brain was broken. The problem was that her brain was working perfectly in an environment where perfect threat detection meant seeing danger everywhere, because danger was in fact everywhere. Fox was actively trying to destroy her career. The press was actively exploiting her vulnerabilities. Powerful men were actively manipulating her access and opportunities. And her nervous system, already hypersensitive from decades of trauma, was responding to these genuine threats with increasing desperation. What happened at Cal Neva matters not because of what specific events might have occurred during that weekend, but because of what those events triggered in a brain already operating at maximum stress capacity. Whatever combination of interpersonal dynamics, power plays, and environmental stressors Marilyn encountered at Frank Sinatra's lodge, they functioned as a final overwhelming input to a nervous system that had no remaining capacity to process additional threat. The hypervigilance that had been building since June intensified beyond sustainable levels. The trust erosion that had been developing reached absolute zero. The medication dependency that had been escalating became the only available tool for managing consciousness that had become unbearable. Marilyn Monroe's story resonates across generations, not because of conspiracy theories about powerful men and cover-ups, but because her psychological crisis represents something tragically universal. The experience of trying to function with a nervous system rewired by trauma, of attempting to maintain normal life while your threat detection system is constantly signaling danger, of reaching for whatever tools might provide temporary relief from unbearable consciousness. These patterns play out in millions of lives that never make headlines. Modern trauma research has validated everything Dr. Greenson observed in 1962. We now understand that childhood trauma literally changes brain structure, that chronic stress creates hypersensitive threat detection systems, that paranoid reactions in traumatized individuals are often adaptive responses to genuine environmental patterns rather than symptoms of psychosis. We have better treatments now, therapeutic approaches specifically designed to help overwhelmed nervous systems learn new patterns. But we still struggle with the fundamental challenge Greenson faced: how do you treat trauma when the environment continues generating genuine threats? If we reframe Marilyn Monroe's final summer through the lens of trauma neuroscience rather than conspiracy theory, we see a different kind of tragedy. Not the tragedy of a woman murdered by powerful men, but the tragedy of a woman whose brain was shaped by decades of trauma, whose nervous system was overwhelmed by genuine contemporary threats, whose available tools for managing psychological crisis were inadequate to the scale of her distress. Dr. Greenson's clinical notes about paranoid reactions weren't documenting mental illness, they were documenting adaptation. Tragic, unsustainable, ultimately lethal adaptation. The woman the world knew as Marilyn Monroe was carrying burdens that no nervous system could sustain indefinitely. Her brain wasn't broken by conspiracy, it was overwhelmed by trauma, by genuine threat, and by the terrible limits of human neurology when pushed past its capacity to cope. That's the real story. That's the tragedy that Dr. Greenson tried to prevent but ultimately couldn't. And that's the legacy that might actually help us understand not just what happened to one famous woman in 1962, but what continues to happen to traumatized humans trying to survive in environments that their nervous systems have learned to perceive as fundamentally, irreversibly unsafe.